The question of what are we here for is as confusing as to whether a hot dog is a sandwich or not. Both questions are highly debated by the world's greatest philosophers, and yet no one has an answer. However, the question of how did we get here is a better place to start, and conveniently, for the inquisitive innovators amongst us, it will give us a lot of answers around how the flows of change work. The opening of the book Sapiens has one of the neatest summaries of the universe and science that has ever been written, and because you can't improve on perfection, I shall just simply repeat it for you now. Yuval Noah Harari states, about 13.5 billion years ago, matter, energy, time, and space came into being in what is known as the Big Bang. The story of these fundamental features of our universe is called physics. About 300,000 years after their appearance, matter and energy started to coalesce into complex structures called atoms, which then combined into molecules. The story of atoms, molecules, and their interactions is called chemistry. About 3.8 billion years ago, on a planet called Earth, certain molecules combined to form particularly large and intricate structures called organisms. The story of organisms is called biology. So, thanks, Mr. Harari. From this short and simple paragraph, it becomes obvious that all known history is but a small fragment of biology. So, today in the episode, we are going to explore the 3 rules of biology that govern the success of organisms and ideas. We'll learn why competition is in our blood, whether equality is even possible, and what makes some nations, religions, or even meme coins grow whilst others disappear into oblivion. Welcome to How to Change the World, the history of innovation with me, Sam Webster Harris, where I am creating the most in-depth blueprint for world changing that exists. In this episode, I'll be telling the story of life itself, a tale that started with stardust, stumbled through some soup, and somehow, quite inevitably, arrived at you listening to this podcast, where I am about to explain to you the 3 laws of biology as proposed by Will and Ariel Durant in the 3rd chapter of their book, The Lessons of History, and it of course really expands on Charles Darwin's theories of evolution. Now this episode is one of our frameworks episodes, but I am double stacking a little bit today, as I'll also briefly cover the entire history of life, as one does like to do on a Thursday. We've already learned so far in the last episodes that if the history of life itself were a 24-hour day, then humans show up at 4 seconds to midnight. We've also found that they rudely started rearranging all the furniture, setting fire to practically everything, and before we'd even taken over the world, we were already disputing who owned what. In fact, probably the 2 most consistent traits that persist throughout all humanity is the profound ability to burn our food and fall out with our neighbours. But we have plenty more important things to learn. As we go about our days, lost in the importance of our own existence, it is easy to forget that we are just fleshy animals like any other. When we do sometimes venture into nature and get a chance to swim in the sea or walk in a forest, we might be reminded of our humble place in the world. Despite our ability to destroy so much of nature, our 8 billion souls are actually a tiny minority compared to the sprawling mass of bugs, birds, fish, reptiles, and other mammals. Yes, they swim, walk, and fly about their lives tremendously unconcerned by the things that we find important. They continue to sting and sing, bark and bite, leap and sleep, regardless of whether one country has invaded another, or if the interest rate is too high for your mortgage. In fact, they don't even care about what Kanye West last posted on the internet, even if he claims differently. To the philosophers amongst us, it is no surprise that the seeking and mating, striving and suffering that plays out in the animals all around us is much the same as our own hunger for food and love. Our games of economic competition, personal status, and endless wars aren't just mirrors of nature, they are nature. In intellectual circles and Silicon Valley, humans like to think in first principles in regards to their ideas. They can escape the limitations of social rules to think only within the bounds of physical possibilities. This framework for thinking is something that I will of course be exploring on this show, but something that I don't think is discussed enough is the laws of life and biology. So this episode is here to the rescue. Let's dig in. Starting at the start, I am dropping you into what is known as the primordial soup and our first law of biology, and that is that life is competition. Picture Earth 4 billion years ago, a boiling cauldron of chemicals. There's lightning cracking overhead, and the oceans fizz with possibility. And inside this bubbling mess, the first cells emerge, tiny bubbles of order in a universe of chaos. Now, imagine, if you will, that you are one of these little blobs and you found a nice little chemical snack. But then you realize another blob wants it. The first competition arises. And in fact, every cell is fighting for a patch of chemical real estate. Some start to invent new ways to eat. One ingenious little blob starts turning sunlight into food using photosynthesis. Others figure out ways to start eating the sunlight eater. And what we find is that the first arms race isn't fought with tanks and treaties, but with enzymes in cell walls, which sounds less exciting, but if you lived on the scale of nanometers, it would be just as terrifying. They might not be fighting over entire countries, but instead little slices of sunlight, passing nutrients and scraps of sugar that all have someone laying claim to it. Competition, it turns out, isn't just a feature of life, it is actually the engine. It's why bacteria multiply greedily and explosively. It's also why 3 billion years later, some cells decided that the single life wasn't for them, and they ganged up to form multicellular organisms under one grand individual alliance. Some of the cells had the job of doing some breathing, others energy. The stronger set handled movement, and so on and so forth. And it bestowed this much larger club of cells with emergent properties of life that appear completely differently when we grow out of the scale of nanometers. Some of these tight-knit gangs of cells crawl around, others swim, some invent teeth to eat each other, and the competition wages on. Eventually, arthropods, a sort of millipede-like creature, were the first animals to crawl out of the oceans to get away from it all. On land, they found plants competing for sunlight and nutrients all over again, playing never-ending games of who can grow the tallest or the fastest. And of course, as more animals arrived, the peaceful land for the millipedes was lost. The need to start inventing claws and camouflage began whilst lost in the game of chasing, hiding, and outwitting each other. Sitting back here in the present day, humans have transcended competition with other species, but we continue to compete with ourselves in all manner of ways. In sports or dating apps, maybe a startup seeking funding, or in the polite but cutthroat world of job interviews. Just like the cells that learn to work together to form larger organisms, we are constantly forming teams. Of course, we had the tribes of old history, but a company of today is just a tribe competing against others in the market to pay its employees and more so its owners. Politicians in your local council compete to lay claim to resources on whether they should renovate the cinema or patch the roads. Your family, community, club, church, party, or nation are each their own organisms. Every one of them a team, probably competing in some way in a game for resources, status, or merely survival. Across history, people have always used violence to gain more than their fair share. Even today, the United States, with 4% of the world's population, still controls 34% of its wealth. That isn't just through innovation. It's because they are willing to deploy violence to protect their shores or to steal the oil of dictators that step out of line. NATO advocates, of course, for peace because America wants to keep things as they are. And the moment that a stronger army from a different nation that it can take something by force, it usually does. Of course, America wants its ally Europe to invest more in defense for a reason, to help keep Russia and China in check. In the lessons of history, Will and Ariel Durant say that a competing group is like a competing individual, proud, selfish, pugnacious, and partisan. We are like this because our genes remember millenniums of chasing, fighting, and killing to survive. They even say that war is a nation's way of eating. After all, it promotes cooperation because it is the ultimate form of competition. And so ultimately, until all states on Earth become a large and unified protective group, they will continue to act like selfish individuals. Competition might sound like a bad thing, but it is simply a fact of life. In fact, it is the reason there is anything at all. So next time you're elbowing your way for a spot on the tube or the last reservation in a restaurant, remember that every Olympics race, YouTube video, or viral meme is just a replay of the original contest in that primordial soup. And that leads us into law number 2. Life is selection. The reason the story of life isn't just a monotonous march of identical blobs, but instead a flagrant parade of all manner of inventive forms, from the simple to the magnificent, the minute to the monstrous. This all happens because of selection and the fact that we are different. If competition is the engine of life, then selection is the steering wheel. If we progress in the timeline from the first land animals into the age of the dinosaurs, we find that they reigned supreme for 200 million years in all different shapes and sizes, from as small as a chicken to as long as a blue whale. New species appeared, flourished, and vanished as the experiment in survival and adaptation played on. Now, I would like you to imagine for a moment you are a Supersaurus. And that is not a joke name, by the way. As a Supersaurus, despite your tiny brain, you are the only dinosaur that as an individual will live over 70 years. You might be surprised to find that you are 100 feet long and your shoulders are 18 feet tall, bigger than a double-decker bus. In fact, with your long neck, you can reach up to the height of a 5-story house to graze on the treetops, which are your favorite. So lucky you, because you are almost constantly eating. In fact, you are so big that even the biggest predators don't concern you. However, one day, the sky lights up, and the world is temporarily on fire, and then very dark and cold. It didn't matter how big you were, how many teeth you had, how loud you could roar, or how super your name was. No, the asteroid that just hit Earth didn't send out a survey, it just hit it and really killed the vibe. Mainly the small, furry, feathered animals willing to eat anything managed to survive this global blackout and move to the next round. Sadly, nature is not at all sentimental, and dinosaurs would be completely forgotten if it wasn't for humans turning them into museum exhibits and action movies. But hey, that is just selection for you, and if you're not adapting, you are just dinosauring towards extinction. Yep, there is no inherent right to existence, and life is unequivocally unfair. As the Durants say, since nature has not read very carefully the American Declaration of Independence or the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, we are all born unfree and unequal, subject to our physical and psychological hereditary and to the customs and traditions of our group. We have diversity in health, strength, mental capacity, and qualities of character. Nature loves difference as the necessary material of selection and evolution. Yes, in her great wisdom, nature is not like a precision engineer making exactly what is needed. She follows a blind process that creates a random array of variation to see which happy accident works the best through survival and lets everything else die. So inequality isn't a glitch in the system, it is the system. Now, once civilization shows up with its complexity and competition, the gap is just as obvious. The people who invent, make, or seize the most of something useful tend to rise even higher, leaving others, relatively, behind. In every society, the act of creating value splits people by ability. Those who could build, lead, or invent were lifted, not by justice, but by utility. Society doesn't care how nice you are or how good your thing was yesterday. The more you contribute today, the more you rise. When people stopped renting physical movies, Blockbuster just died. In the end, the only equality of the marketplace is that everything must earn its place, or be replaced. The Durants say that nature smiles at the union of freedom and equality in our utopias, for freedom and equality are sworn and everlasting enemies, and when one prevails, the other dies. This is a little humbling to accept for our modern way of thinking, but when people are completely free to do what they want, their differences start to show and multiply. Just look at the 19th century in England and America. Freedom led to innovation, ambition, and massive inequality. So to keep things from getting too lopsided, some freedoms have to be limited. State control on some aspects of banking or energy, and a fair tax and legal system. But if you go too far with state control, like in communist regimes, you end up with forced equality that actually strangles the whole system. Imagine a school where the music teacher decides everyone will play same instrument and notes for an upcoming show. Very equal, but now there's no solo for the grade 8 violinist and no triangles for the kids that never even had a music lesson. Instead, one big, inclusive, happy disaster. We see that people with exceptional talents both want and need freedom to use them. Meanwhile, those performing low economically are more likely to want equality, but a system that's built to keep everything completely equal ends up creating less for everyone. And it's curious that despite our quest for more equality, we forget how much we celebrate inequality. We buy tickets to see the best singers. We host competitions to find the best tennis players, and we give awards to the best actors. And in fact, this is important. Doctors and pilots have licenses because if you're not very good at doctoring or piloting, you will kill someone. Yes, we might say that we like to treat people fairly, but if you're going under the knife for surgery, you don't actually care if the surgeon tries their best, if their best isn't very good. You only care if the surgeon is one of the best, and thus, inherently, you really don't like equality. So, instead of aiming for complete equality, we should aim for a better goal, equality of opportunity, where we let everyone develop their talents freely, not just because that's fair, but because it makes a stronger society. When groups come to compete, after all, which they do, the ones that let their people thrive and develop their individual talents usually come out on top. So to summarize, equality of opportunity is good, but forced equality of outcome is not. Now, the debate of where to draw the line in topics like how much inheritance is good versus bad, how much should we subsidize education or healthcare, etc., is a much greater step into politics beyond the scope of this podcast, where I'm trying to not be political, but even biology, it seems, has some opinions on the matter. Now, on to the third law. Life must breed. So if competition is our engine and selection is the steering wheel, then reproduction is the fuel that keeps the whole vehicle of life moving. Without reproduction, the story of life would have ended before the first paragraph of the first chapter. If we rewind for a second back to our primordial soup 4 billion years ago, the remarkable thing about the first genetic code was not just that it self-organized, but it had a relentless urge to keep copying itself. It turned lifeless chemicals around it into organized life. And if it didn't do that, it would have just been a momentary flash of some organized molecules that would have then fallen apart, been forgotten, and you would never have existed. Over time, as these replicating pieces of genetic code evolved into more organized little blobs, some that accumulated resources through different tricks, as we've discussed, like eating each other or eating the sun, well, these techniques were simply different strategies to build enough energy to then duplicate. Another quote from the Durants, they say that nature has no use for organisms, variations, or groups that can't reproduce abundantly. In fact, nature has a passion for quantity. She likes large litters and relishes the struggle that picks the surviving few. We find that nature is highly indifferent about individuals, as their survival is only temporary after all. It is only a species that survives the passages of time. Furthermore, nature doesn't care about civilization or barbarism, or whatever your strategy might be. Whether you eat a balanced diet of fruits and vegetables, or, like a black widow, you prefer to eat your own husband. As long as you keep having babies, nature will bless you with the gift of a continued existence. And in a nutshell, that is all progress is. When we consider the advancement from unicellular life to multicellular life, a fun fact about humans is they are 30 trillion cells, which, in perspective, does seem like progress. And continuing with the human story, when humans discovered fire, it wasn't just a handy tool for warmth and warding off predators. It made changes to our digestion, brain, and society that lasted purely because of one crucial factor. People with fire had more babies. Our fertile species that could dominate in any niche instead only became constrained by local resources to the point that we expanded again and again across the entire planet. Once humans had reached their first capacity limit across the entire globe and couldn't find new territory to populate, they had to innovate a new way to grow the population. And remember that nature doesn't care about living standards. The agricultural revolution meant a huge drop in our quality of life, with harder labour, a terrible diet of just a few crops, and much more disease. However, on average, the extra energy availability allowed nations that farmed to grow and outcompete their wild neighbours. It's surprising to realise that human civilizations that succeed are not always the most civilized, or the kindest, or even the most intelligent. They are the most fertile ones. And this story repeats with every great civilization. Was ancient Rome worried about low birth rates? You can bet their Caesar salad they were. By the 1st century BC, birth rates were dropping, and the state did grow anxious. In fact, Julius Caesar himself tried to bribe and cajole Romans into having more kids. He gave them tax breaks, public honours, he even banned childless women from being allowed to wear jewellery. The empire's fate was tied to its population. When birth rates fall, new and fertile rivals are always waiting in the wings, eyeing up a piece of your land. Right, now let's do a hypothetical demonstration of numbers. Pretend that you are interested in maths and that Japan and Nigeria both have a population of 1 million people each. Now, Nigeria currently has a fertility rate of 5.2 children per woman, whilst Japan has just 1.2 children. If we were to let these numbers play out for 100 years, that's almost 4 generations and just a blink in evolutionary terms. Well, by the end of this 100-year experiment, Nigeria's 1 million people has ballooned to 46 million people, whilst Japan has shrunk to just a minute 0.15 million people. So in just a few generations, Japan, which started at the same size, suddenly ends up 293 times smaller. So you can see why nations worry about low birth rates. However, this law about reproduction is not just about babies. Ideas themselves want to breed too. Businesses, languages, TikTok dances, if they don't spread, they disappear. The world's most successful religions didn't just have catchy stories, they had the best share button built into them. That's why you've heard of Christianity and Islam, but not the cult of Cybele or Cybele, within which the priests all had to castrate themselves, which does seem like a very off-putting rule to recruit more priests. Regardless, everything around us in the world is in a constant state of being replaced. Politicians that keep a party alive, students and teachers that keep a school running, even the GPS satellite system survives because humans keep putting up new satellites faster than the old ones fall back to Earth. Ultimately, every business survives by reproducing something that people want. Whether that's a cup of coffee or a pencil or books that we buy. Apple only survives because every few years, people keep buying millions of new iPhones and laptops. Conversely, Kodak died because people stopped buying the camera film that they produced, and their model simply stopped replicating. In fact, there is even a saying in podcasting that if you aren't growing, you are dying, which of course is much the same for business. And it is more true than many of us like to admit, when the idea of growth for growth's sake can seem greedy. But by this logic, existence itself is an act of greed. So this seems like a good moment for me to recommend that you share this podcast with a friend so that it doesn't die. Just saying, it's a law of nature that I, for one, don't want to argue with. And on the subject of arguments and dying, we have a little extension topic. Growth has always been constrained by the 3 horsemen of apocalypse. Famine, disease, and war. These have always served as natural checks on any population. An abundance of food can create too many mouths, which of course leads to not enough. When we think about agriculture, humans were always in a race to increase capacity through new innovations of tending or fertilizing their crops, or protecting them from pests, disease, or robbers. Over history, we see that every increase in food supply abundance was quickly cancelled out by increased births, which sometimes led to disastrous consequences. Imagine you're living in rural France in the 1690s. The harvest fails. Again, neighbours are disappearing and ultimately, 2.8 million people starve. And that's not just a big number, it's villages, families, friends. Well, today we have a reversal in fortune where the poor literally eat burgers, pizzas, Mars bars, whilst the rich afford their avocados, asparagus, and grass-fed steak. However, currently in the wealthiest nation in history, 74% of Americans are overweight. And in fact, 43% of all humans on the planet are currently overweight. The abundance we live in of 8 billion people on the planet who mostly suffer from eating too much food is entirely reliant on ammonia fertilizer. Without it, our farmlands would only support half the world's current population, which is amazing how propped up our entire existence is by this single support beam. And on that, let's talk about disease. Overcrowding in cities and living closely with animals breeds diseases that throughout history have chronically ravaged our species. It happened a lot more after the agricultural revolution when we started building settlements. Very handy inventions like soap and sewers did improve things a lot. And because of these and also organized food systems, ancient Rome was the first city to reach 1 million inhabitants. But of course that didn't last as their society collapsed. 1,000 years later, the Black Death in the 1300s killed potentially 200 million people globally, mostly over Eurasia, where 25% of the population was wiped out. That's roughly the same as every population of every capital city in every country disappearing, twice. So if you are interested in the size of cities, well, it wasn't until the 19th century, after vaccines were invented, that London became the first city to reach 2 million inhabitants. And it wasn't until 1950, after antibiotics were invented, that New York and Tokyo became the first megacities to reach 10 million people. Amazing as it is that these inventions help us not die, But it's important to realize that they also help us live together. But remember, of course, that isn't something we've always been that good at, because we have the last apocalypse, which is war. From our ancient history of tribal conflicts to today, war, as I said earlier, was a way of one nation to eat another. Now, of course, you don't want to kill everyone in a different population. War, although incredibly scary and terrible, is usually less deadly than a plague. The most bloody battle in the War of the Roses, the Battle of Towton, is estimated to have killed 1% of the English population, which is definitely a lot. 15 million people died in the First World War, whereas 20 to 50 million people died in the Spanish flu pandemic a few years after. Over our agricultural history, the average death rate was about 15% of humans by violence, which, to be fair, is a lot of humans. What might surprise you is that if you consider the 20th century, and you even include the First and Second World War, it was still by far the most peaceful century in human history to be alive, with about a 5% death rate by violence. Before that, about 3 times more people were dying each century. That does put it in perspective. Now today, in the 21st century, we seem to be closer to about 1% death by violence so far, which hopefully stays the same or gets better. But we'll see. At least for now, more people are dying by suicide, and in fact twice as many people are dying from diabetes. And in the words of Yuval Noah Harari, sugar is now more deadly than gunpowder. So why did we used to have so much war? Well, war used to be the main way of acquiring resources to survive. In 1847, when an Irish family stared at an empty table, their potato crop had failed again. Outside, though, ships loaded with edible grain left for England, because England had won the wars over the Irish. As a result, in the potato famine, 1 million Irish people died, whilst the English population was fine. In the modern day, you can still conquer oil fields by war, but we live in a mostly knowledge-based economy. The Magnificent Seven are all technology companies: Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, Meta, Microsoft, Nvidia, Tesla, whereas 70 years ago it was oil, steel and cars, products that were pumped or mined out of the ground. Now, when we consider famine, disease and war, we can see how much they held the growth of human society back over the ages. Although they no longer hold us back in the same way now, they are still a permanent presence in our lives. A systems breakdown could expose our huge leverage of population compared to food capacity. A new plague could still spread, and times of peace don't last forever, especially during imbalances of power and inequality, which, as we've learned, is a permanent feature of life. Interestingly, we found ourselves now with a new conundrum as different limitations seem to be affecting our fertility rate. New trends in society, economics, equality, and interests are changing how we reproduce. But of course, the fundamental law that adaptation is essential to survival will always be true. So fertility and population growth is something we will discuss further in future episodes about systems. But now we can bring this all together. As we've learned, if you want to take your ideas to the next level, don't buy a ladder, use some biology. You should understand and appreciate the power of competition, selection, and reproduction. It's honestly no wonder that these rules are the staple elements of any nature documentary. In it, we might see gorillas competing for food and mates, with lions showing displays of courage, and of course feathered birds with funny dances and fancy songs. They of course have a seemingly unnecessary requirement to show animals boning and having babies, which might make some families uncomfortable, but this is just reality, and life is reproduction, and reproduction is life. So what does this all add up to? We began with stardust, visited the primordial soup, the thunder of the dinosaurs, the fertility and cleanliness of the Romans, and we took these lessons into the present day, where you, bundle of organized atoms, happen to be listening to this podcast, wondering about what it all means, and more importantly, asking yourself who you're going to share this episode with so that this podcast doesn't die before I get to the end of the saga that we have ahead of us. We have only just got started and we're getting our fundamentals together. The 3 laws of biology aren't just some practical tools for biologists studying animals. If history is a river, these laws are the current beneath the surface. Sometimes they are gentle, sometimes they wildly bash us against the rocks and suck us into whirlpools and don't spit us out for a few hundred years. However, in the long term, they do keep moving us forward. So if you want to innovate and build something that lasts, you need to work with the current and not against it. The world doesn't reward the cleverest idea on paper, it rewards the idea that can compete and multiply in the wild. It rewards the unfair advantages, but only for a short time before the inevitable requirement to adapt comes back. And that is our framework over for the day. Now, as we are still early days into the show, Just a little reminder that these framework episodes are as much why the show exists as the history ones. To not just tell stories of history, but to extract the patterns, mental models, and practical lessons that anyone can use to nudge the world in a better direction, or perhaps just be a little bit more informed about how it really works. Armed with the right understanding, after all, we can be part of the next great leap forwards and hopefully avoid the collapses of our past, at least for a while. Now, in terms of sources, for this episode, I used Will and Ariel Durant's book, The Lessons of History, and specifically the third chapter on the laws of biology. We also snuck a cheeky peek into the intro of Yuval Noah Harari's book Sapiens, and if you're interested, the start of his second book, Homo Deus, has an entire chapter on famine, disease, and war. This episode was written, edited, produced, recorded, etc. entirely by me, Samuel Webster Harris. I even make all the music. My wonderful designer is Francisca Cujaya, and Jeremy Enns is my podcast mentor, and they are both available to hire, and I can highly recommend them. I am delighted to say that I hit my long-running goal of releasing this episode in time for the full moon. Now, will our next episode be out with the new moon and this become a regular feature? Who knows? But what I can say is that the next episode will be about the cognitive revolution and the development of advanced language and cooperation skills, and perhaps surprisingly, things like capital punishment, male aggression, and the great domestication of our species. So, something to look forward to. In the meantime, I hope this episode gave you a new way to look at the world. The next time you see a new idea, technology, or way of living, perhaps you will ask how well it competes, what unique advantages or adaptations does it have, and can it reproduce like bunny rabbits? Right. What we know is a drop, and what we don't know is an ocean. So stay curious.